All right, everybody. Today I'm going to be covering the famous Neve 1073 preamp. It's not a very complicated kind of piece of equipment, but it's kind of like a staple in a lot of modern studios. This thing has been around a long time. It's definitely legendary. It was made by Rupert Neve. It originally was part of a console. So, like this little piece that you see here, originally that's part of the Neve console. And because of that, it kind of developed a distinctive sound, kind of how it was what was needed from it in the beginning, which is being part of a board. It needed to be able to handle a lot of different types of mics, a lot of different types of signals, and also since it used a lot of transformers instead of valves, it had an input transformer and an output transformer. So basically, this thing had to handle a bunch of different signals, and it did it with clarity. And because of how it was constructed, it adds a lot of kind of subtle harmonics, and that's kind of what gives it that sound, that kind of clear, punchy sound. So, because as a preamp, one reason why people will use this, whether it's the plugin or the real one, people are after that harmonic content. And that's pretty good. It's kind of like a small form of distortion in a way. If you have a really clean kind of signal that's peaking a lot, distortion has a tendency to kind of reduce the peaks. So it's almost like a mini compressor. It's not really a compressor, but it will lower your peak signals and makes your overall mean volume louder. So that's one thing that's cool about this preamp is like if you put something through it, not only will it kind of control the signal a little better, it even smooths things out electric wise, but it also puts that harmonic distortion that usually sounds pretty good, and it will make your overall level sound higher, so it sounds louder. So it's a pretty simple device. I'll just kind of go through the different parts of it. At the top there is the red knob. That's going to be basically the core of the whole thing. That's your preamp. It's kind of weird. On the right, it's the line signal, and then on the left, there's two different mic kind of sections. But in generally, what you're doing, instead of adding gain like a lot of preamps, you're kind of just changing the sensitivity. It's a technicality, but it's basically the same thing. Any sort of line signal, maybe you're using it in a desk kind of way, you're using it for mixing, you're going to have that on the right side there. Also, if you're tracking a line instrument, you'll probably want to use the right side, the line. And then on the left, that's the different mics. And one last thing about this knob here is when you're trying to set your level here, just know that the line signal, it's going to be probably a lot louder than the mic one. So just be careful if you're kind of flipping through this on the hardware unit or on the plugin that your signal level can jump quite a bit. So just keep that in mind. On the upper right there, you're going to see that little switch from high to low. This is kind of like your mic impedance. So when it's on low, the impedance is 300 ohms. And when it's on high, it kind of changes depending on where your gain is, but it's usually like around 600 ohms. Now, if you have the hardware unit, this switch is kind of on the back. It's kind of hard to get to. On the plugin, it's just right there in the front. You can kind of switch between the two just to kind of like pick to taste what you prefer. It's just kind of like a characteristic of the mic preamp. Just feel free to switch back and forth. If you have the hardware unit, probably high is what most people usually leave it on. And it has a built-in pad there too, and that just kind of lowers signals by around 20 dB. So just flip that on if you're having some distortion, even at low levels. Sometimes the pad gives you a little extra room there to try to get a clear signal. So in this middle part here, this is another very famous part of the Neve 1073, even though there's not a lot of parts to it. This is the EQ. So this EQ, one thing that's kind of special about it is the shapes of the curves. You can see that there's only a few different settings for the mid and the low, and the high is basically just like a shelf, and the low shelf too. And these are part of what gives it its sound as well. So on the real hardware version, especially in the low end, the signal is actually like, I guess you could say the sound running through it's a little higher in level. So on the on the plugin, make sure you can push it a little bit, especially on the lows, to try to match the sound. But in general, the plugin and the hardware, the curves are about the same. It's just the plugin, you can usually push it a little more than you would in the hardware version. Just be very careful, like in most preamps, you don't want to distort the signal, but with this preamp, that's kind of the character you're going for. So instead of doing subtractive EQ, you can feel kind of a little more confident with this one boosting. You're going to get more of that harmonic character. So for that high and mid there, you have a range of about 18 dB plus or minus that you can play with. And on the lower band, it's around plus or minus 15. And you can see there on the mid range and the low range, there's kind of like a concentric ring. So there's like a ring and then the knob itself. The outer ring you can pick kind of what frequency you want to affect. So the mid-range has like 360, 700, 1.6, 3.2, 4.8, 7.2, and the low one, you can go from like 35, 60, 110, 220. These are numbers that, it's kind of like the API style where it's sometimes people find it freeing to only have like a few you could pick from. So you just pick a few. The machine is designed so it'll sound good. So you can feel kind of relaxed in the sense of like, oh, okay, let me try to pick a frequency. I'm just going to work with what it gives me. It's kind of like a constraint, but it's also a very musical constraint. And you think about all the albums that were made with this preamp, they all were using those numbers too. So it kind of puts you in line with all the records that have come before you. And it kind of frees your mind a little bit so you don't have to find exact frequencies. Just pick one that you need to boost or cut and shape the sound the way you want to. And finally, that bottom knob there, that's just kind of like a low cut. So yeah, if you're dealing with material that doesn't really need a bass, just kind of, cut it out there and you won't introduce like harmonics to your higher pitch stuff that from the low end that you don't want. So if you're doing something that doesn't have a lot of low frequency, feel free to scoop out some of that low end there. That way, all the sound that is going through this thing is passing through the transformers in a musical harmonic way, and you're not muddying up kind of like the magic that this machine has. So at the bottom there's little switches that you can turn the EQ on and off, or you can turn the phase on and off. And on both the plugin and the hardware, even if you don't really affect the signal at all, just the sound passing through the preamp gives it a sound. So some people will actually just put whatever they're recording, they'll just put it through the machine without actually changing any of the EQ, and it still gives it a sound. And a lot of that's because of the input transformer and output transformer combo. And that's kind of what, there's a lot of saturation going on here. So even if you don't move the knobs at all, this thing will give a sound to your signal. And the last thing here is if you're using the plugin, specifically the UAD plugin, that little slider on the right, that slider is supposed to kind of control the output. So say you do your processing and your signal's a little too hot, you can kind of pull it down with that so you can match the level, so you can see you can compare, right? Like you don't want to have a signal and then put it through the Neve and the signal's way louder and you're like, oh wow, it sounds better. That's a trick, right? So what you want to do is whenever you do your Neve processing, use that slider on the right, and that'll kind of make your signal equal to the original signal, and then you can compare the really subtle kind of effect that the Neve is really doing. So make sure you're not listening to something higher and thinking it's better. Match the level so you can really hear what this thing is doing. It is pretty subtle, but it does add, a lot of harmonic kind of character. On the plugin at the bottom there's that little knob. That's just the clean gain. So like a real Neve console wouldn't have that. That's a plugin thing. So basically, like if you want to change the signal without, any of the modeling, you can just use that knob. But in general, you're using this to try to get the sound of it. So, you can do clean processing any way you want to. You could even put like a gain plugin after this plugin if you wanted to change the level in a clean surgical way. But part of the fun of something like this is you want that vintage character. You want the sound that it gives. So might as well use the whole thing, right? Like use the modeling, use the slider, and you're going to get kind of that sound. And then later on, for your mix or whatever the context of your song is, that's where you can kind of do the clean balancing so you can make your levels and do it in a nice clean way. So that's pretty much it. It's a simple device. It's legendary. It's really good for fattening up your signal. It's also good that, say you have a bunch of tracks, if you put it on all of them, you'll have a kind of a consistency in your mix too. So it's always a good thing kind of with preamps and stuff. Just as an experiment, try processing all your tracks through this individually or your buses, and you'll see that if you add the same type of harmonic content to your bass, to your vocals, to your synths, to your drums, you add this to all of them and it'll kind of bring your mix together in kind of transcendental way. And that's one reason why people like the Neve board a lot too. So you can kind of process your whole mix individually through this, and you'll see that in the end that they can kind of get like the same filter, the same sheen on top of it. So at the end here, I'll just have a few examples of it on kind of like a drum bus, and you can kind of hear the saturation and kind of like what it does to the signal. So that's pretty much it. I definitely recommend getting any form of this, a plugin, the real one if you can afford it. It's a solid workhorse. You can take anything you throw at it. It's a classic sound. It's timeless. So yeah, thanks for watching.